She ordered an escort for one night, just to save her career. But when he knocked on her door, he wasn't who he claimed, and his secret could change everything. The soft hum of the city filtered through the tall windows of Emma Chen's Upper West Side apartment, the muted sounds of traffic and distant horns blending with the faint classical music playing from her smart speaker. She stood in front of the full-length mirror, smoothing the emerald silk of her dress over her hips, studying herself as if searching for any flaw that could betray uncertainty. The reflection that looked back at her was poised and polished, the product of years of clawing her way up New York's most competitive marketing ladder. But beneath the perfect hair and understated diamond earrings, her pulse raced. The Hartwell Foundation Gala was the kind of event careers were made or quietly dismantled over. One wrong impression and the coveted partnership at Pinnacle Advertising, the prize she'd chased for 7 relentless years, could slip into someone else's hands. Her boss had been blunt on the phone that morning. "Emma, bring someone who compliments you, someone who makes the room believe you belong at the very top." And therein lay the problem. Her personal life had been a casualty of her ambition. Long hours, weekend calls, working vacations, every relationship she'd tried had wilted under the weight of her schedule. She hadn't been on a real date in months, and now she needed not just a date, but a man who could navigate high society conversation without embarrassing her in front of the city's most influential donors. 3 days ago, in a moment of both desperation and calculated logic, she'd made the call to elite companions. The agency's reputation was as crisp as its website. Nothing scandalous, nothing seedy, just polished professionals hired to make clients look good in public. She had been specific. She wanted Michael Torres, the agency's crown jewel, fluent in 3 languages, a master conversationalist with a discreet, elegant presence. Mrs. Patterson, the coordinator, had assured her, "You're in the best hands, Ms. Chen." Emma had memorized the details of their cover story, how she and Michael had met at a book signing in Soho, bonded over a shared love of travel and coffee, and had been dating casually for 3 months. She'd rehearsed their first lines together in her head so many times that she could say them in her sleep. When the doorbell chimed precisely at 7 o'clock, she allowed herself a small smile at his punctuality. She slipped on her heels, grabbed her clutch, and opened the door, only for her breath to catch in her throat. The man standing there was not Michael Torres. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut to precision and storm-gray eyes that seemed to see far more than they revealed, he wore his tuxedo as though it had been made for him, not rented, but tailored over years to fit the man he had grown into. The faintest smile touched his lips as he took in her surprise. "Ms. Chen?" His voice was deep, smooth, and confident. "I'm afraid there's been a change. Michael had a family emergency, so I'm stepping in tonight. My name is David." Emma's practiced composure faltered for the briefest moment. "David," she repeated, tasting the unfamiliar name, weighing the risk of taking him versus showing up alone. "I understand this is short notice," he continued, stepping just enough into the doorway for the warm scent of his cologne to reach her. Subtle, expensive, not the kind of fragrance worn without intent. "Mrs. Patterson briefed me on the event and your expectations. I assure you, I'll meet them." Her instincts screamed to refuse, but the clock was merciless, and the thought of arriving alone and explaining why felt like professional suicide. She stepped aside, motioning him in. "We'll need to go over the story, quickly." David entered, his gaze sweeping over her living room, the modern lines, the curated art, the stack of business books on the coffee table. "You have excellent taste," he murmured. And it wasn't the empty flattery of a man doing his job. It was an observation, deliberate and thoughtful. She launched into the script. "We've been dating for 3 months, met at a bookstore in Soho. You work in consulting, which explains the travel and why you're not always at company events." He didn't just nod. He leaned in slightly, his eyes holding hers. "What book were you buying when we met?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Business strategy, international market expansion." "I was in the philosophy section," he said smoothly, "looking for Marcus Aurelius. We started talking about Stoic principles in modern leadership." The details slid so seamlessly into place that Emma almost believed it herself. There was a quiet authority in the way he spoke, as if he wasn't inventing, but recalling. And yet something in his tone, a depth, that didn't quite belong to a hired role, stirred questions she didn't have time to ask. She grabbed her wrap, heading for the door. "Let's go," she said, more to herself than to him. As they stepped into the elevator, she felt the warmth of his hand rest lightly on the small of her back, guiding her without force. It was a small gesture, one that shouldn't have made her pulse jump. but it did. And as the numbers descended toward the lobby, Emma realized that for the first time in days, she wasn't thinking about the Hartwell Foundation or the partnership. She was thinking about the stranger beside her, and why he felt nothing like the man she'd been expecting. The black sedan purred to a stop at the Mandarin Oriental, its sleek frame catching glints from the building's glass facade. Emma smoothed her dress one final time, forcing her mind back to the real mission of the night, the Hartwell Foundation contract. This wasn't about her date, no matter how distracting his presence felt. Inside, the ballroom was a cathedral of wealth. Crystal chandeliers scattering light across polished marble, the air perfumed with white orchids, and the faintest trace of champagne. Conversations rippled in measured tones, punctuated by bursts of laughter from those already deep into the night's flattery and networking. David moved beside her like a silent current, steady, unhurried, commanding attention without asking for it. She'd expected to be the one leading him through introductions, guiding him past conversational landmines. Instead, he slipped into the role effortlessly, greeting Richard Hampton with a handshake so firm and assured it momentarily disarmed her boss. "Richard," David said smoothly, "Emma's been telling me about your passion for the Hartwell Foundation sustainability work. It's a rare thing to see genuine commitment at the corporate level." Richard's brows rose slightly, surprised by the depth of the opening gambit. "Oh, you're familiar with the initiative?" David's gaze was unwavering, his voice calm but resonant. The challenge of making environmental responsibility profitable is one of the most complex puzzles in modern business. It's not just about messaging, it's about shifting market behavior at scale. Emma almost forgot to breathe. This wasn't vague charm, it was targeted insight, the kind she used herself when closing high-stakes deals. And he wasn't parroting something she'd told him. His take was sharper, more nuanced, as if he'd lived it from the other side of the table. She introduced him to Catherine Hartwell, the foundation's president, and watched in quiet amazement as David inquired about the regional pilot programs she'd launched in Southeast Asia, referencing economic ripple effects and community adoption rates as though he'd been briefed for weeks, not minutes. Catherine's eyes lit up in delight at the rare depth of conversation. With every exchange, Emma's initial skepticism wavered. He remembered names instantly, recalled tiny details from conversations, and asked questions that drew people in rather than putting them on the defensive. Yet there was an undertone, a certain way he carried himself, as though he wasn't learning this whirl, but returning to it after some absence. During a brief lull, Emma guided him toward the edge of the dance floor, seeking a moment of privacy. "You're very good at this," she murmured, keeping her tone light but her eyes sharp. David smiled faintly, as though accepting a compliment he'd heard before. "I make it a point to understand the people I'm around, even if you've just met them? Especially then." His gaze lingered on hers, an intensity there that made her feel as though he were reading more than her face, as if he were mapping the thoughts she hadn't spoken. Before she could probe further, the string quartet swelled into a waltz. Without hesitation, David extended his hand. "Dance with me." She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His touch was warm, his grip firm but unhurried, and when he drew her onto the floor, it was as though the rest of the room blurred into watercolor. He led with the quiet assurance of someone used to steering the course, not just in dance, but in life. The scent of his cologne brushed against her senses as they moved in perfect rhythm. Her pulse quickened, and she hated that she didn't know if it was because of the gala or because of him. "You're nervous," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost beneath the music. "I always am before events like this," she replied, avoiding his. "That's James Alexander," her assistant whispered as she passed with a tray of champagne. "Technova's CEO. He never shows up to these things." Emma turned toward the commotion and caught something in David's expression. The briefest flicker of tension, gone in an instant, replaced by his usual composure, but she'd seen it. "Interesting man?" she asked softly. David's eyes didn't leave hers. "Any man who doesn't notice you is a fool." The words should have been simple flattery, but the way he said them, low, deliberate, almost defiant, made the air between them tighten like a drawn bowstring. Emma's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't know yet what David was hiding, but she was certain now that he was hiding something. The gala wound down in a haze of music, clinking glasses, and the soft murmur of final goodbyes. Emma felt the weight of the evening pressing on her shoulders, not in the way exhaustion settles after a long night, but in the way questions sink deep, demanding answers. David had been flawless, almost too flawless. Every conversation he touched seemed to turn in her favor, Richard was suddenly warmer toward her than he'd been in months. Catherine Hartwell had made a point of telling her how rare it was to meet a man so in tune with purpose. But it was the moment James Alexander's name had entered the room, and David's reaction, that clung to her like a burr she couldn't shake. The ride back to her apartment was quiet. Outside, Manhattan blurred into streaks of gold and steel under the street lamps, but inside the car, the silence between them was thick, humming with something she couldn't name. David sat with one arm draped casually along the seat, yet she noticed his jaw tighten whenever his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. When they arrived, she found herself hesitating at the curb. "Would you like to come up for a coffee?" The words slipped out before she could weigh them, before she could decide whether she was inviting him in out of courtesy or curiosity. His eyes searched hers for a moment as if he were measuring a risk, then he nodded. "I'd like that." Her apartment, warm and softly lit, felt suddenly smaller with him in it. He loosened his tie, rolling back the cuffs of his shirt with the practiced grace of someone who never fumbled in his own skin. She busied herself in the kitchen, trying not to watch him as he moved through her space like it was familiar. Pausing to glance at the books on her shelves, the framed photo of her parents in California, the art print she'd bought years ago in a cramped Parisian gallery. "You like order," he said, standing in her doorway. She turned, a little startled. "And you can tell that from looking at my shelves?" His lips curved slightly, from looking at everything. They talked for hours, the coffee cooling untouched. His stories skirted around the edges of who he was. Travel, consulting work, ideas about leadership, but never quite touched the core. And yet, the way he listened to her, the way his eyes locked onto hers like no one else existed, made her... When he returned, his expression was smooth again, but the warmth in it was dimmed. "I should probably get going," he said softly. She nodded, though something in her bristled. "You never did tell me who you really are." He stopped in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. "Maybe I'm just a man who wanted to give you the night you deserved." And then he was gone, leaving her apartment and her thoughts too quiet. Emma sat in the dim light, her mind racing. Every instinct from her brief college days dabbling in investigative journalism was alive again, tugging at the threads of the story he'd woven. It was too seamless, too intentional. By the time the first gray light of dawn slipped through her curtains, she knew two things. David was not who he claimed to be, and she was going to find out exactly why he had walked into her life that night. Morning light streamed through Emma's living room, catching in the rim of her untouched coffee cup. The clock read 8:13, but she had been awake for hours, replaying the previous night like a film stuck on loop. David's voice, his effortless charm, the way he'd slipped into every conversation at the gala like a man born to navigate those rooms. And the phone call on her balcony, sharp and clipped, filled with language that didn't belong to an escort for hire. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard of her laptop before she finally gave in to the pull. She started with elite companions, combing through the polished profiles, the carefully curated headshots, the blurbs full of credentials meant to soothe high-paying clients. Michael Torres was still listed as unavailable due to personal reasons. There was no David, not in the roster, not in the archives, not even in the cached pages she'd dug up through search tricks she'd learned years ago. Her pulse quickened. She moved on to his name, first as David with the usual P. Were mutations then combined with consultant, New York, corporate strategy. Nothing. It was as if he didn't exist until he'd appeared at her door. Frustration edged into obsession. She tried an image search using a candid shot she'd taken of him on her phone last night. Just a quick snap, meant to remember the moment they'd looked out over the ballroom from the mezzanine. The search churned and then, her heart lurched. An image appeared on the results page, cleaner, sharper, more formal, but the eyes were unmistakable. Gray, piercing, paired with the headline, "The Ghost of Silicon Valley, Inside the World of Technova CEO James Alexander." She clicked before her brain caught up. Article after article painted the portrait of a man who'd inherited a technology empire at 25 after his father's sudden death, who had tripled its valuation in less than 5 years, who never appeared at public events unless absolutely necessary. He was fiercely private, notoriously allergic to press, and, according to one profile, immune to the usual trappings of billionaire excess. Her stomach tightened. She scrolled through photos. James at a shareholder meeting, James exiting a sleek black town car, James standing beside world leaders at a tech summit. Different settings, different expressions, but the same man who had stood in her doorway last night claiming to be an emergency replacement escort. It made no sense. If this was James Alexander, why had he been at the gala in her company under a false name? Why step into a role so far beneath his station, so dangerous for his public image? A buzzing in her pocket pulled her out of her thoughts. A text. "Can we meet? I have something important to tell you." Her thumb hovered over the screen. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let him vanish back into whatever insulated, guarded world he came from. But another part, the part still haunted by the way he'd looked at her on the dance floor, like she was the only person in the room, needed answers. "My apartment. 1 hour." The time between sending the text and the knock at her door was a slow burn of adrenaline and anger. She rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd demand the truth. When she opened the door, he stood there in casual clothes, expensive casual, she realized now, and for the first time, he looked unsettled. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. "Yes, we do, James." His eyes widened fractionally, and that was all the confirmation she needed. He froze, the name hanging between them like a live wire. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then slowly, James stepped further into her apartment, closing the door behind him with deliberate care, as though slamming it might shatter the fragile air between them. "You know," he said finally, his voice low, not quite a question. "I know enough," Emma replied, arms folded, pulse pounding. "I know you're not David. I know you're James Alexander, CEO of Technova Industries. I know you're worth more than I can wrap my head around. What I don't know," she took a step closer, heat rising in her chest, "is why you showed up at my door, pretending to be my hired date." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, passing over his face. "It's complicated. Try me." James let out a slow exhale. Yes fixed on hers. "I was never meant to be at that gala. I had a meeting at the Mandarin with potential investors. It ended early, and I decided to cut through the ballroom to avoid the photographers outside. And then," his mouth twitched in the faintest shadow of a smile, "you were there, looking at me like I was just a man. Not a headline, not a target. You could have corrected me," she shot back. "You could have said no." "I could have," he admitted, "but I didn't. Do you have any idea what it's like to live your life behind glass? Every conversation rehearsed, every handshake calculated, every woman weighing your net worth before your words? For one night, I wanted to see what it was like to be wanted for myself. So I let you believe I was someone else." Emma's laugh was sharp, humorless. "And you think that makes it better? That lying to me was some noble experiment?" "I think," he said quietly, "that it gave me the most genuine night I've had in years. And yes, I should have told you sooner." His honesty, or what sounded like it, tugged at something in her, but she fought it down. "You risked your reputation. You risked mine. Do you have any idea what would happen if the press got hold of this?" "They won't. Not unless you tell them. You're in control of this, Emma." The words unsettled her. She wasn't used to men like him. Powerful men, handing over control, but before she could decide if she believed it, his phone buzzed on the counter. He ignored it. "You should get that," she said, more to break the tension than anything. He shook his head. "Right now, this is more important." He took a step closer, and the air between them seemed to tighten, charged. "Emma, I'm asking you for a chance. No lies, no games. Let me show you who I am when there's nothing to gain. Let me prove that what happened between us wasn't about money or status." Her breath caught. She wanted to say no, to protect herself from whatever storm would come with him. But the memory of his hand at the small of her back, the way he'd looked at her during the waltz, was still branded into her skin. "This isn't a fairy tale," she said at last. "Your world and mine, they don't match." "Then we'll make one that does," James said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the flicker of fear that she might still turn him away. Emma didn't answer right away. She could feel the path splitting before her. One direction toward safety and solitude, the other toward risk and something that might be extraordinary. Finally, she said, "One dinner, you tell me everything, no filters, and then I'll decide." Relief washed across his face almost imperceptibly, but his voice stayed calm. "Tomorrow night, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one will interrupt us." And just like that, the terms were set. But Emma knew that whatever answers came next, they wouldn't be simple, and they wouldn't come without a cost.